Greetings, this is Dr. Tamilio, and we are coming towards the end of our class, our course. And the last lecture is going to be on political philosophy, particularly how do we justify the existence of the state, of authority, of hierarchy, and what is our role as citizens of the state. This seems to some extent like a crossover from ethics, and a lot of political philosophy is based on ethical thought, right? What are we required to do? What should we do? I asked you in the text in this book to read three pieces, one by Aristotle, one by Thomas Hobbes, and one by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We've talked about Aristotle in the past, and I still want you to read his piece from Politics because it's foundational. But I want to spend some time talking about Hobbes and his work from Leviathan, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his notion of the social contract, which is sometimes, again, discussed at length in courses in ethics. When I've taught courses in ethics at Salem State and elsewhere, we've dealt with Rousseau, but today we're going to be talking about him in terms of political philosophy. I figured the best way to talk about both Hobbes and Rousseau is to read from this text for you. Nigel Warburton, A Little History of Philosophy. If you're interested in philosophy, I think I mentioned this book on the syllabus. This is worth its weight in gold. Warburton does a great job of summarizing the thought of over 36 major philosophers in the Western context of philosophy. And I really like what he has to say about Hobbes and Rousseau, so it would probably just be easier for me to read what he writes and then add commentary and some final thoughts. I will follow this with a discussion question on Canvas, so be sure to look there. So, reading first chapter 18 from, actually, no, I'm going to do that one second. Sorry, that's Rousseau. Reading first the part on Hobbes, chapter 10 from Warburton, entitled Nasty, Brutish, and Short. And you'll see why he calls this chapter that. Anyway, Thomas Hobbes was born in 1588. He died in 1679. And he was one of England's greatest political thinkers. What's less well known is that he was also an early fitness fanatic. He would go for a long walk every morning, striding quickly up hills so as to get out of breath. In case he had any good ideas while out, he had a special stick made with an inkwell in the handle. This tall, red-faced, cheerful man was with a mustache and a little wispy beard, had been a sickly child. But as an adult, he was extremely healthy and played real tennis into old age. He ate lots of fish, drank very little wine, and used to sing behind closed doors and out of earshot to exercise his lungs. And of course, like most philosophers, he had a highly active mind. The result was that he lived to 91, an exceptional age for the 17th century, when the average life expectancy was 35. Despite his genial character, Hobbes, like Machiavelli, we didn't cover Machiavelli in this class, but if you are interested in political philosophy, he is a must-read, particularly his work, The Prince. Hobbes, like Machiavelli, had a low view of human beings. We are all basically selfish, driven by fear of death and the hope of personal gain. This is what Hobbes believed. All of us seek power over others, whether we realize this or not. If you don't accept Hobbes' picture of humanity, why do you lock the door when you leave your house? Surely it's because you know that there are many people out there who would happily steal everything you own. But you might argue only some people are that selfish. Hobbes disagreed. He thought that at heart we all are, and that it is only the rule of law and the threat of punishment that keep us in check. By the way, don't ask me why I'm drinking coffee from a Christmas mug. I just really like this mug for some reason. Anyway, we continue with Hobbes. The consequence of this, he argued, was that if society broke down and you had to live in what he called a state of nature without laws or anyone with power to back them up, you, like everyone else, would steal and murder when necessary. At least you'd have to do that if you wanted to carry on living. In a world of scarce resources, particularly if you were struggling to find food and water to survive, it could actually be rational to kill other people before they killed you. In Hobbes's memorable description, life outside society would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, hence the title of this chapter. Take away the power of the state to prevent people from helping themselves to each other's land and killing whoever they want to, and the result is a never-ending war in which everyone is against everyone else. It is hard to imagine a worse situation. In this lawless world, even the strongest wouldn't be safe for long. We all have to sleep, and when we are asleep, we are vulnerable to attack. Even the weakest, if cunning enough, would be able to destroy the strongest. You might imagine that the way to avoid being killed would be to team up with friends. The trouble is, you couldn't be sure that anyone was trustworthy. If other people promised to help you, then it might sometimes be in their interest to break their promises. Any activity that required cooperation, like growing food on a large scale or building, would be impossible without a basic level of trust. You wouldn't know that you'd been tricked until it was too late, and perhaps by that time, you'd literally have been stabbed in the back. There would be no one to punish your backstabber. Your enemies could be everywhere. You'd live your whole life on your own in fear of attack. Not an attractive prospect. The solution, Hobbes argued, was to put some powerful individual or parliament in charge, some sort of government in charge. The individual in the state of nature would have to enter into a social contract. We're going to come back to that term with Rousseau, but suffice it to say for now with Hobbes, he's saying the individual in the state of nature would have to enter into a social contract, an agreement to give up some of their dangerous freedoms for the sake of safety. Without what he called a sovereign, which is some sort of a leader, life would be a kind of hell. This sovereign would be given the right to inflict severe punishment on anyone who stepped out of line. He believed that there were certain natural laws that we would recognize as important, such as that we should treat others as we'd expect to be treated ourselves. Obviously, you can see a correlation to this in the Kantian categorical imperative. Laws are no good if there isn't someone or something strong enough to make everyone follow them. Without laws and without a powerful sovereign, people in the state of nature could expect a violent death. The only consolation was that such a life would be very brief. So now, Leviathan, which you read a section from for today. It was published in 1651. In this book, Hobbes, it's his most important work, explains in detail the steps needed to move from the nightmarish situation of the state of nature to a society secure in which life is bearable. Leviathan, that word Leviathan, refers to a gigantic sea monster that's described in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. For Hobbes, it was a reference to the great power of the state. Leviathan, the book, opens with a picture of a giant towering over a hillside, holding a sword and a scepter. This figure is made up of lots of smaller people who are recognizably still individuals. The giant represents the powerful state with the sovereign as its head. Without a sovereign, Hobbes believed, everything would fall apart and society would decompose into separate people ready to tear each other to pieces in order to survive. Individuals in the state of nature, then, had very good reasons for wanting to work together and seek peace. It was the only way they could be protected. Without that, their lives would be terrible. Safety was far more important than freedom. Fear of death would drive people towards forming a society. He thought that they would agree to give up quite a lot of freedom in order to make a social contract with each other, a promise to let a sovereign impose laws on them. They'd be better off with a powerful authority in charge than all fighting each other. Hobbes had lived through dangerous times, even when he was in the womb. He was born early because his mother had gone into labor when she heard that the Spanish Armada was sailing to England and would probably invade the country. Fortunately, it didn't. Later, he, Hobbes, escaped the dangers of the English Civil War by moving to Paris. But the real fear that England could possibly descend into anarchy haunted this later writing. It was in Paris that he wrote Leviathan, returning to England soon after it was published in 1651. Like many thinkers of his day, Hobbes wasn't just a philosopher. He was what we would now call a Renaissance man. He had serious interests in geometry and science and in ancient history as well. As a young man, he loved literature and had written and translated it. In philosophy, which he only took up in middle age, he was a materialist, believing that humans were simply physical beings. There is no such thing as the soul. We are simply bodies, which are ultimately complex machines. Clockwork mechanisms were the most advanced technology in the 17th century. Hobbes believed that muscles and organs in the body were the equivalent of these. He frequently wrote about the springs of action and the wheels that move us. He was convinced that all aspects of human existence, including thinking, were physical activities. There was no space for the soul in his philosophy. This is a modern idea that many scientists hold now, but it was radical for his time. He even claimed that God must be a large physical object, though some people took this to be a disguised way of declaring that he was an atheist. Anyway, critics of Hobbes think he went too far in allowing the sovereign, whether it was a king or queen or parliament, to have such power over the individual in society. The state he describes is what we would now call an authoritarian one in which the sovereign has almost unlimited power over citizens. Peace may be desirable, and fear of violent death a strong incentive to submit to peacekeeping powers. But to put so much in the hands of an individual or group of individuals can be dangerous. He didn't believe in democracy. He didn't believe in the ability of the people to make decisions for themselves. But if he had known about the horrors committed by tyrants in the 20th century, maybe he would have changed his mind. Hobbes was notorious for refusing to believe in the existence of the soul. And then this chapter ends by leading into the next one, which we're not going to read. He says, René Descartes, his contemporary, in contrast, believed that mind and body were completely distinct from each other. We discussed Descartes much earlier in the course. This was probably why Hobbes thought Descartes was much better at geometry than philosophy and should have stuck to that. Anyway, so here we have Hobbes talking about the need for government, the need for authority, the need for a sovereign, a king, a president, whatever you want to call it, to rule over the people, or else we would be in a state of anarchy. We wouldn't be able to trust one another. We would constantly be looking over our shoulders. We would constantly be at war with one another. In fact, such a state of being might play upon the worst part of our nature. In other words, we might take preventative measures. We might kill others before they kill us if we think that is, the reality that we live in. Now, related to that, you had to read a piece by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in chapter 18 in Warburton entitled Born Free, talks about Hobbes's philosophy. So I'm going to read through that and then offer some other thoughts. In 1766, a small dark-eyed man in a long fur coat went to see a play at the Drury Lane Theatre in London. Most of the people there, including the king, George III, were more interested in this foreign visitor than in the play being performed on stage. He seemed uncomfortable and was worried about his Alsatian dog, which he had to leave locked in his room. The man didn't enjoy the sort of attention he got in the theater and would have been far happier out in the country somewhere on his own looking for wild flowers. But who was he? And why did everyone find him so fascinating? The answer is that this was the great Swiss thinker and writer Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was born in 1712. He died in 1778. A literary and philosophical sensation, Rousseau's arrival in London at David Hume's invitation caused the sort of commotion in crowds that a famous pop star would today. By this time, the Catholic Church had banned several of his books because they contained unconventional religious ideas. Rousseau believed that true religion came from the heart and didn't need religious ceremonies. But it was his political ideas that caused the most trouble. Man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains, Rousseau declared at the beginning of his book, The Social Contract. It's no surprise that revolutionaries learned these words by heart. Maximilien Robespierre, like many of the leaders of the French Revolution, found them inspirational. The revolutionaries wanted to break the chains that the rich had placed on so many of the poor. Some of them were starving while their rich masters enjoyed a high life. Like Rousseau, the revolutionaries were angry about how the wealthy behaved while the poor could barely find enough to eat. They wanted true freedom together with equality and brotherhood. It is unlikely, though, that Rousseau, who had died a decade before, would have approved of Robespierre sending his enemies to the guillotine in a reign of terror. Cutting off your opponent's heads was closer in spirit to Machiavelli's thinking than to Rousseau's. According to Rousseau, human beings are naturally good. So you can see the opposite thought here to Hobbes in many ways. Rousseau thought human beings were naturally good. Left to our own devices, living in a forest, we wouldn't cause many problems. Of course, Hobbes thought the opposite. But take us out of this state of nature and put us in cities and things start to go wrong. We become obsessed with trying to dominate other people and with getting other people's attention. This competitive approach to life has terrible psychological effects, and the invention of money just makes it all far worse. Envy and greed were the result of living together in cities. In the wild, individual noble savages, and that's in quotes, would be healthy, strong, and above all, free. But civilization seemed to be corrupting human beings, Rousseau felt. Nevertheless, he was optimistic about finding a better way of organizing society, one that would allow individuals to flourish and be fulfilled, yet which would be harmonious with everyone working towards a common good. The problem he set himself in The Social Contract, published in 1762, was to find a way for people to live together that would allow everyone to be as free as they were outside society while still obeying the laws of the state. This sounds impossible to achieve, and perhaps it is. If the cost of becoming part of society was a kind of enslavement, that would be too high a price to pay. Freedom and strict rules imposed by society don't go together, since the rules can be like chains preventing some sort of action. But Rousseau believed that there was a way out. His solution was based on his idea of the general will. The general will is whatever is best for the whole community, the whole state. When people choose to group together for protection, it seems that they have to give up many of their freedoms. That's what Hobbes and Locke both thought. It's hard to see how you can remain genuinely free and yet live in a large group of people. There have to be laws to keep everyone in check and some restrictions on behavior. But Rousseau believed that as an individual living within a state, you can both be free and obey the laws of the state, and that rather than being in opposition, these ideas of freedom and obedience can combine. It's easy to misunderstand what Rousseau meant by the general will. Here's a modern example. If you asked most people, they'd prefer not to have to pay high taxes. In fact, that is a common way for governments to get elected. They simply promise to lower the rate of taxation. Given the choice between paying 20% of their earnings as tax and 5% of their earnings as tax, most people would prefer to pay the lower amount, the 5%. But that is not the general will. What everyone says they want, if you ask them, is what Rousseau would call the will of all. In contrast, the general will is what they ought to want and what would be good for the whole community, not just for each person within it thinking selfishly. When working out what the general will is, we have to ignore self-interest and focus on the good of the whole society, the common good. If we accept that many services, such as the upkeep of roads, need to be paid from taxation, then it is good for the whole community that taxes are high enough to make this possible. If they are too low, then the whole society will suffer. That then is the general will. The taxes should be high enough to provide a good level of services. When people get together and form a society, they become a kind of person. Each individual, then, is part of a greater whole. The way Rousseau felt that they could stay truly free in society was to obey laws that were in line with the general will. These laws were created by a clever legislator. This person's job was to create a legal system that helped individuals keep in line with the general will, rather than pursuing selfish interests at others' expenses. True freedom for Rousseau is being part of a group of people doing what is in the interest of the community. Your wishes could coincide with what is best for all, and laws should help you to avoid acting selfishly. But what if you oppose what would be best for your city-state? You as an individual may not want to conform with the general will. Rousseau had an answer here, but it's not one that most people would like to hear. He famously, and rather worryingly, declared that if someone failed to recognize that obeying a law was in the interest of the community, then that person should be forced to be free. That's a quote, forced to be free. His point was that anyone who opposed something that was really in the interest of their society, while they might feel that they were choosing freely, wouldn't genuinely be free unless they fell into line and conformed with the general will. How could you force someone to be free? If I force you to read the rest of this book, then that wouldn't be a free choice you had made, would it? Surely, forcing someone to do something is the opposite of letting them make a free choice. For Rousseau, however, this wasn't a contradiction. The person who couldn't identify the right thing to do would become freer by being forced to conform. Since everyone in a society is part of this larger group, we need to recognize that what we should do is follow the general will, not our selfish individual choices. On this view, only when we follow the general will, are we truly free, even if we are forced to do so. That is Rousseau's belief, but many later thinkers, including John Stuart Mill, we studied Mill's utilitarianism in this course, Mill argued that political freedom should be freedom for the individual to make his or her own choices as far as possible. Indeed, there is something slightly sinister about the idea of Rousseau, who had complained about humanity being in chains, suggesting that forcing someone to do something is another kind of freedom. The chapter ends. Rousseau spent much of his life traveling from country to country to escape persecution. Immanuel Kant, in contrast, barely left his hometown, though the impact of his thought was felt throughout Europe. And of course, we discussed Kant earlier in the course, so you see some of the connections here between these philosophers. So this is Nigel Warbottom's summation of both Hobbes and Rousseau. We as Americans, and you as Americans studying in an American university, are well versed in history and know that one of the founding principles of being an American are freedom, liberty, being your own person, having free will, free thought. And those are hallmarks of our Constitution, of our way of life. But of course, we do not have total freedom. Total freedom would lead, or at least could lead, to anarchy. Everyone doing exactly what they wanted to do. We have to have laws to keep ourselves in check. My question to you is, do you agree more with Hobbes or more with Rousseau? Are there limits to having a sovereign? What limits should we have when we think of authority? Now, of course, there are many different systems of government. If you've studied political science, you know that. Even in the world today, you're well aware that there are different ways that countries work. There are different political organizations, be it communism or democracy or socialism or totalitarian regimes. There's many different ways that sovereigns lead their people. It might behoove you to stop and think, especially in the light of this global crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, which system of government keeps us safer? Which system of government gives us ample freedom, but freedom within order, so to speak? So I want you to be thinking about that. I want you to reflect more upon Hobbes and Rousseau. If you'd like, I can scan the chapters I just shared with you. Make sure you read the sections in the textbook that deal with this idea of the individual and the state. How do these work together? I mean, to some extent, the state is made up of individuals, at least in a democratic system, ideally. Whereas in a totalitarian regime, in a dictatorship, the state is seen as the individual who is at the helm, and the people are sort of subservient to the will of the sovereign. So think about this. Be thinking about these ideas. Be thinking about how best does a society function? What are the limits to freedom? And what are the limits to imposing order and rule upon the people? Okay, I'm going to post a discussion question regarding this. So be sure that you answer it. We are coming to the end of the semester. Classes end May 1st, I believe, the end of this week. So you will have a final exam. It'll obviously be a take-home exam. You are home. And it'll be essay-oriented. And I will give you details about that separately. Also, if you wish to write a term paper for the course, that will offset your final grade. However, you are able, if you wish, to take this course as pass-fail. That's a change that the administration of the university made in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll send a separate email about all of that. For now, make sure you think about what I've been talking about this past half hour, and be sure that you answer the discussion question. Alrighty? Take care, everyone. I hope you're safe. Hope you're keeping your social distances and washing your hands and doing all those good things. See you later.